All right, let's finish up this section 2.3. So this is what I'm doing right now on that worksheet are numbers 6 through 10, basically. All right, but let's go through this. I'm going to show you 4 different things here. Oops, forgot to change this thing. All right, and let's change that. There we go. All right, now let's try it. Watch. I'm gonna do this. Start off with I. This kind of seems weird, but you'll see why I'm doing this in a second. So I equals I. Would you agree? All right. Here's where we're going to get into a little bit. I squared. We already know what I squared is. What's I squared equal to? It's -1. All right. Do you agree? All right, because we just know it. And we talked about why it is. All right. So we talked about that yesterday. Why this is -1. So we'll just write it down. What if I did this, though? What if I said I cubed?
-I.
Now, how'd you get that?
Because I times -1 equals -I.
Okay, good. Because look, I cubed is the same as I times I squared, isn't it? Everybody agree with that, wouldn't they? Because I to the first, right? I could do this. Watch. I to the first equals I to the second equals -1. Look at this right here. So I want to figure out what I cubed is. So I squared is -1, correct? Times I, or we could just write it, -I. Make sense? So if you forget it, I mean, it's kind of nice to memorize it, but if you don't memorize it, you could always break it down like this. All right, break them down into things that we know. We know I squared is -1, so I cubed is I squared times I. It's -1 times I, which is -I. All right, so I'm going to add that to my list. Let's do another one. I to the, what do you think?
4.
To the 4th. Now let's think about, excuse me, what I to the 4th is equal to. Let's do the same thing. Now, it's kind of nice to break them down into I squareds because we know what I squared is, don't we? So let's break this down into I squared. So if I broke this down into I squareds, I would get I squared times what? I squared. Agreed? Isn't that I to the 4th? That's right. Because watch, I squared is -1. This I squared right here is also -1. -1 times -1 is +1. So I to the 4th is what? +1. See that? Let's do I to the 5th. I'm not going to add it to our list, and I'll show you why in a second. But watch, let's figure out what I to the 5th is. Now that we know that I to the 4th, that's definitely one you need to memorize. Definitely memorize that I to the 4th is 1. Okay? So if I want to figure out what I to the 5th is, how could I break that down? I could break it down into I to the 4th times what? I to the 1st. Isn't that I to the 5th? Why did I break it down using an I to the 4th? Because I know I to the 4th is just 1. Right, so look, if you want, you can just kind of cancel it out, right? Why do I cancel that out? Because it's a 1. 1 times I is I. So I to the 5th is equal to I. It kind of starts that same pattern over again. What do you think I to the 6th is equal to? -1. What do you think I to the 7th is equal to? -I. What do you think I to the 8th is equal to? A 1. You follow me? And you could keep repeating that pattern over and over and over again. Make sense? Let's go a little bit bigger than that. Let's go, different color. Let's go I to the 10th. Now, how can we figure out what I to the 10th is? Well, notice what I said, what I to the 8th is. I'm going to put an I to the 8th right there. I to the 8th is also equal to what? 1. So, what do you think I to the 12th would be?
1.
Why?
Because it's also 12 is also divisible by 4.
That's right. 12 is divisible by 4. Well, you say, well, what does that have to do with anything? Well, every time, this repeats this pattern. You see this? This is like a circular pattern. It just keeps on going and going and going, right? It just keeps repeating itself. You follow me? Every time you have a multiple of 4, I to any multiple of 4 is always going to be 1. So I to the 8th is going to be 1, right? Because you can break them down into I to the 4ths, can't you? And they'll all be even, right? You have an even number of I to the 4ths. I didn't say that exactly right, but you get what I'm talking about. So I to the 12th would be 1. I to the 16th would be what? 1. I to the 20th would be 1. You with me? So keep that in mind. So what I'm going to do is think about I to the 10th. I want to think of the You can think larger or smaller. I like to think smaller. I like to think of the largest multiple of 8 that is just smaller than 10. I'm not 8, but 4. The largest multiple of 4, okay, that is smaller than 10. What would that be? So I've got 4, 8, 12, 16, 20, 24. Which one is just a little smaller than 10? I to the 8th. Why did I pick that number? Because I to the 8th is going to go to what? To 1. What's left over, though? I to the 8th times I what? Squared. Doesn't that equal I to the 10th? It does. So watch what I do. Why did I pick I to the 8th? Because I to the 8th is a 1. I to any power of 4, okay, any multiple of 4 is equal to 1. It will cancel each other out. It will cancel out. So I to the 10th is I to the 8th times I squared. I to the 8th cancels out because that's a 1, so what am I left with? I squared. What's I squared? We know what that is. It's a negative 1, and that's my answer. So I to the 10th is equal to negative 1. Because any multiple of 4, I to any multiple of 4 is going to be a 1. Because think about it. What's I to the 8th? I to the 8th is the same as I to the 4th times I to the 4th. Do you agree? Because what do you do when you multiply? You add exponents, right? So what's I to the 4th? It's 1. What's this I to the 4th? It's 1. So anytime I have all 4s here, right, it's going to be a 1. No, you don't want to think of it that way. That's because 12 is a multiple of 3, right? So it's only think of that when you think of multiples of 4, okay? So don't do that with this and this. Just do it with multiples of 4. Make sense? So I to the 12th is also what? 1. What's I to the 48th power? It's 1. You got it. Okay? How did I know that? Because I looked at the exponent. If that's a multiple of 4, then that thing is a 1. What if I did this? What if I did I to the 49th power? What's that equal to? Well, let's think about it. I to the 49th. What is a multiple of 4 just smaller than 49? 48 is, isn't it? Do you see that? You have to know your numbers. You got to know a little bit about multiplication tables and stuff like that. You got to be able to visualize and see it. So I to the 48th is a multiple of 4, and then times what? Just times I. Good. See that? Because 48 times 1, or 48 plus 1 is 49. And that's our rule, isn't it? When you multiply things together, you add the exponents. So what is this? I to the 48th is just a 1. So what are we left with? Just an I. So what's I to the 49th power? Is just I. Making sense? It's kind of interesting, isn't it? Let's do a couple more. Just making these up. Let's go I to the 17th. Let's figure out what that is. So what number are you going to think? 17. What's a multiple of 4 that's just a little smaller than 17? 16, right. So again, you got to know your multiplication tables, right? You got to know your multiples of 4. So it's I to the 16th times what? Times I to the 1st. It's not just times 1, it's times I to the 1st. Now, why did we pick I to the 16th? What's so important about that? Becomes a 1, doesn't it? It's a multiple of 4, and anytime you have I to a multiple of 4, it becomes a 1. So that is just a 1. What am I left with? Just left with I, and that's my answer. So I to the 17th is the same exact thing as just I. We good? What about I to the, I don't know, 25th? Yeah, why did I pick that one? I'm trying to think. Yeah, it's I. It's the same thing, because 24th, right, and then I. Let's do this. This is what I meant to do. I to the 23rd. Let's do to the 23rd. What's a multiple of 4 that's just a little smaller than 23?
20.
20, right. Because 24 is bigger, right? So I always like to pick the one that's a little smaller. So it'll be I to the 20th times I to the what? To the 3rd, right. Because again, you're multiplying together, but what do you do with the exponents? You add the exponents. Make sense? I to the 20th is just a 1. This is I cubed. What do we know I cubed is? It's negative I. That's right. Now, if you didn't remember that I cubed was negative I, you could always break that down again, couldn't you? Into I squared times I. I squared is negative 1. times I is negative I. So if you don't remember I cubed is negative I, you could always break it down again. But it's a lot easier if you just memorize that I cubed is negative I. Wouldn't you agree? Because there's not that many. I mean, you know that I to the first is I. That's easy. You know I squared is negative 1. That's easy. I to the fourth, we talked about that a lot. That's easy. I cubed is the one that people forget about. But, just remember it's negative I. And if you don't, you can always do this to figure it out. So I to the 23rd is the same thing as negative I. So you think you can handle that? All right, go ahead and try those. Try 6 through 10, and it's exactly the same kind of problem we did. You got to know your multiples of 4, and if you're good with your multiples of 4, you should be able to do this. All right, so that's it. So we are finished section 2-3. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to give you a worksheet, and the worksheet covers all of section 2-3. We basically split it up into 2 or 3 days, right? Kind of 2.5 days. I consider this a half day. All right, so I'm going to give you a worksheet that covers both things on section 2-3, and why don't we just take a quiz as soon as we come back on Monday? There's no reason to postpone it any longer. It's pretty easy stuff, isn't it? I think you can handle this. All right, just look over it again. Watch a YouTube video Sunday night before you go to bed. It'll help you go to sleep, okay? And at least it'll stick in your mind and you can dream about imaginary numbers, okay? All right. That's it.